future of money. Digital money. In 2017, Visa launched a campaign where it would award $10,000 to small American businesses that stopped accepting cash. In other words, at some point in the not-too-distant future, cash will become increasingly rare. And this is nothing more than the latest evolution of money in an increasingly digital society. But this raises some questions. Having all of our banking transactions electronic is extremely convenient, but it also has its downside, because electronic transactions leave traces. But how bad is this? Be that as it may, several countries are rapidly moving toward a society with less and less cash in circulation, as is the case in Sweden, although many others still resist the temptation. But the trend is inevitable, and the war against physical money has already been waged by economists, central banks and governments. Societies without real money seem like a science fiction scenario, but they are just an inevitable development of an increasingly digital world towards an increasingly faster and more practical reality. The question is, what is the true price of this? After all, what is money? When did the money appear? The history of money is as old as the history of civilization itself. It is no surprise that money is as old as the wheel and fire, and emerged as our economy became increasingly complex. When we found ourselves faced with the need to negotiate with other people, we realized that we needed something that everyone agreed had a specific value, and that could be measured, calculated and divided. In ancient Rome it was salt, in Africa and China it was shells. The Aztecs used cocoa seeds. But also grains, metals, ivory, meat, leather, fish, whatever. Anything that could be used as a bargaining chip would most likely be used as a bargaining chip by someone. Over time, we realized that it would be interesting to have things that lasted longer than salt, that were more practical than shells, and that didn't spoil as quickly as cocoa beans. Thus metal coins were born. Still, carrying bags and bags of currency was incredibly dangerous and inconvenient even back then, so we decided to put the value of the coins on paper, and thus paper money was born. Those valuable little notes that we carry to this day. The cost of physical money. But money is an expensive commodity. That's right. Money costs money. Banknotes, coins, pennies, all of this has a cost. To give you an idea, here in Brazil, the cost of manufacturing a 5-cent coin is 30 cents, while the cost of a 10-cent coin is 40 cents. Not to mention the logistics of the thing. After all, money doesn't magically appear in ATMs. It is necessary to print the notes and produce the coins, transport everything in tens of thousands of armored cars, and then leave it all safely stored, praying that no one comes and steals everything, especially if it is here in Brazil. This is because, to give you an idea, in the United States alone, money theft alone costs businesses around $40 billion a year, which is more than credit card fraud, internet fraud and bounced checks, add it together. The digital economy and its consequences, the evolution of payment methods, driven by the digital revolution, and mainly by changes in consumer habits, who now know that they can have a more practical and less bureaucratic daily life, has meant that the economy itself has also become digital. Today, operating money digitally is not only faster, it is easier and relatively safer, especially if we consider the boost in digital payments after the start of the pandemic. Since the beginning of 2020, online purchases that do not require the use of physical cash have skyrocketed, and experts believe that, even with the end of the pandemic, they will continue to be on the rise because on many occasions they are much more practical. In countries like Denmark, Finland, Norway and Sweden, in particular, cash has practically become a thing of the past. But it's not just money that has become digital. Banks, payment methods and new currencies too. And in recent years, there has been a surge in digital banks. The reason is clear. They are much more practical and less bureaucratic than traditional banks, in addition to having a much lower operating cost. And payment methods have also evolved. Contactless payment with your cell phone or smartwatch. We recently had Pix here in Brazil. And cryptocurrencies have become increasingly common and are being increasingly used in transactions, especially to protect themselves from the devaluation of currencies that has been occurring due to the unrestrained printing of governments. However, there are two big problems with migrating to a society without physical money: the government and the banks. At least if we use the current system. In Brazil, we know the case of a Brazilian, Daniel Fraga, who had serious problems in exposing society's authorities and public and private institutions as manipulative bodies, to the point of having his assets inspected at his home. On the other hand, he decided to sell everything he had and buy it in Bitcoin, which to this day is a decentralized currency that can be used both online and offline. On the internet, in a didactic, simple and practical way, the presence of Renato Amido went viral, who decided to expose ways of decentralizing his financial wealth using Bitcoin. Digital Revolution and its Defects. Kenneth Rogoff, economics professor at Harvard University and former chief economist at the International Monetary Fund, states that having a digital system helps prevent crime and tax evasion. For example, direct quote, "Digital operations are more transparent, making the government's task of undermining crimes such as fraud, money laundering and tax evasion, for example, easier. As a result, I hope the tax system in Brazil is simplified and fairer." Is that too much to ask? Rogoff states that physical money in itself is not bad. On the contrary, we should always have it as an option, but most high-value notes, for example, are usually used for illegal transactions. Quote, "The idea here would be that only lower denomination notes would continue in circulation to meet daily transactions, while larger amounts could only be paid and received electronically, so they could be easily monitored in the case of illegal operations." And although the black market is constantly mentioned as the main reason why governments want to get rid of paper money for good, as in the case of India recently, according to the UK National Treasury, banks are almost twice as likely to be involved in crimes such as money laundering. Recently, the European Central Bank stopped printing €500 notes, and countries around the world stopped allowing cash transactions exceeding very high values. As a result, robberies at commercial establishments plummeted. But not cyber attacks. And here's an important thing. It's much more difficult to deal with cyber attacks than traditional bank robberies. According to reports from ABC News, a single hacker managed to steal personal information from 106 million people in a matter of days. And the worst part? The attack was only noticed months later. In other words, many companies are definitely not prepared to deal with this type of thing. With the end of physical money, whether partial or complete, payments would become much more efficient, theft would be practically non-existent, and tax collection would be much faster and, depending on the country, much fairer. But what is the price of this? In the early 1970s, a group of researchers were selected for a simple task. Imagine that you work for the KGB and need to create a perfect surveillance system that can monitor people without necessarily scaring them. The idea they came up with was genius. A debit card. That's right. Debit cards would be great forms of monitoring without necessarily being intrusive. They would be sold as a convenience, and at no point would it cross your mind that you were being monitored. Do you agree? Bjorn Eriksson, former president of Interpol, thinks it would be risky to completely abolish physical money, having the same point of view as Rogoff, that cash should exist as an option. And that matters because data is the new gold. It's basically the most coveted commodity in the world today. Electronic transactions, in turn, are a great way to acquire data that, in this case, are used to trace consumption profiles and feed an entire industry of data sellers. But wait, it's not your data such as your name, telephone number, email or how much you spent at the bakery that they keep an eye on, but rather the residual data, the things they can infer about you from this information, which are just the tip of the iceberg. In the case of data brokers, they know what you do, the things you buy, where you go on vacation and what you spend most on, for example, so they can even calculate the amount of alcohol you drink and whether you are a potential alcoholic or not. About 10 years ago we had the famous case of the American retailer Target, which, based on customers' consumption patterns, knew which ones were pregnant, how many months they were pregnant and which products they would likely buy next, so they sent promotional coupons to customers, specific to each stage of pregnancy. The story only gained notoriety when a father went after him to find out why he started receiving so many promotions for pregnant women, as he still didn't know that his grandson was on the way. But that was more than a decade ago. Today's technology is much more advanced, assertive and discreet. And what does this have to do with money? So it is very likely that we are witnessing the end of physical money and the rise of digital money, but it is always good to emphasize that if there is a villain in these changes, it will never be technology, but rather the human being behind it.